Has Update 2.0 saved Project Motor Racing? In this video, I'm going to tell you what's good about the update, what's bad about it, and the current state of this racing simulator. I also am going to offer some perspective on this simulator that will help explain why, if you look over the internet, there's so many ranging views on this title. In one place you'll see people saying it's the worst thing ever, and in another place you'll be seeing people really quite optimistic. I'm going to explain why that's the case. So make yourselves a cup of tea, subscribe so you then have the power to unsubscribe in the future. That's only available to subscribers, that feature. And of course you can click the like button if you want to. Also, if you like what we do, you can join the Cult of Miserable Sadness and Despair by becoming a channel member. That allows us to continue being super opinionated and not have a real job. So I really appreciate it, thanks to everyone else that's already suffering the financial loss. So before I address the negatives, and they are quite negative, I'm first going to talk about the positives. And I have to say, Update 2.0 is a significant update to this title. It would be fair to describe it as game-changing, but technically all updates are. Now, the biggest thing you notice are improvements to the user interface. It's a lot snappier to navigate around, it's a lot more clear. It's not necessarily the shiniest of user interfaces, it's not the most fancy, but it's a lot more functional and easier to use and more clear and obvious to use than the previous user interface. I don't think the UI was the game's biggest problem in the first place, but I think they've actually done a good job in just making the game snappier and easier to interact with and to get to what you want to do even faster. And the other big improvement with this update is the game is a lot more stable. We live streamed it for 6 hours and we didn't have a single crash to desktop. Previously, we probably would have had 3 or 4 crashes to desktop in that same time period. Now, though that overall stability's improved, we have noticed a lot of people getting kicked out of multiplayer races at the start and things inside of the game not necessarily being the most stable. But, the overall game engine is more stable, so that's a great improvement and a lot less frustrating. Now, with this update and some of the previous updates, there have been tweaks and changes to car handling and force feedback. To me, as someone that spent a long time with the original launch of the game going through force feedback settings, it kind of just feels like a bunch of arbitrary changes for the most part. And the handling of the vehicles, some kind of handle okay, some are really quite fun to drive, but other vehicles just don't seem to make much sense at all. Even the MX-5 at moments just seems really super unhinged, and other moments is really quite stable. And it's really hard to know how much of that is the underlying physics of the vehicle and how much of that is the force feedback, or the force feedback settings, or the physics of the force feedback interacting with each other. And it's like that with all the cars. Like, it's just really inconsistent. It's very similar to Project Cars 2 back in the day, where one car you'd drive and you'd have a really great time and you'd be like, okay, this maybe isn't the most realistic sim I've ever driven or the most pleasurable sim I've ever driven, but it's really quite fun and it makes sense and I'm having a good time. And then you jump into another car and you'd be like, dear God, what on earth is this? I've gone from driving simulator to Trolley Sim Pro. So this really has that kind of Project Cars 2 content all over the place thing going on. And as a result, even when they make changes, even when they change the default force feedback and whatever they do with this, it all kind of just feels a bit all over the place and not very consistent. So you still have to get into the menus and fiddle with the force feedback and fiddle with a lot of the car settings if you want to get something more generally usable and maybe more with what you would expect from other simulators or even just other video games that tend to be just a little bit more consistent in behaviour. Now, before I go mega super negative, these are more the sort of neutral points here, or middling points. What I will say as well, especially if you're on console, you do now have a game where you can jump in and do multiplayer races in a range of different vehicles, from MX-5 to vintage GT cars. And that works quite well in that you can jump into a race and do a race straight away. I think on console, people are really desperate for that and other alternatives to Gran Turismo 7, and there's a real big gap in the console space for that type of gameplay that I think PMR and Rennsport are trying to fill, but not quite filling it as well as they probably could do. But because of the desperation there on the console side, you do get something from this that is lacking in the console space, in that you can do jumping online racing with quite varied and quite deep, in terms of simulation, vehicles. I'm not saying it's realistically deep necessarily, but you have a lot of the stuff that PC sim racers are very familiar with. The car options, the ability to tweak a lot of the settings and dial stuff in, and then to be able to do the jumping online racing. Whereas a lot of the other console games at the moment are very limited. Obviously, if you're a PC gamer, at the moment, you know, it's quite easy to host sessions in AC or play AMS2 and get your friends to jump into them, or then do things like Le Mans Ultimate, iRacing, Race Room. There's a lot more options on PC, so it makes it a lot harder to really justify this title, especially given how it really doesn't feel like a released title still compared to those other games. So this is where, at the beginning of the video, I said there's this real big range of views, and where I think they're coming from is that the console players, this title actually stands out quite a bit compared to console games, but for the PC gamers, this really feels quite lackluster and much below other titles that are currently available on PC. So that's where I think a lot of that conflict is coming from, and I think that's why this is actually a much more appealing game for console players at this point in time than it is for PC gamers. Now I want to go into the real negatives of this title at this point in time, and some stuff that I think is horrendous, absolutely terrible, but not as bad as your biscuit falling off in your tea. And actually, maybe worse than a bourbon falling into your tea, quite possibly. So the biggest issue this still has, especially on PC, is the frame rate. And the frame rate relative to the number of cars you've got on the screen, the graphics, is absurd. I have a 5090, I have a 9950 X3D chip. I also played the previous version of this game on a 3080 Ti. I've got 64 gig of RAM. I speak to multiple people that are playing this game with different varied systems, and they are all having woeful performance on the PC side, especially again when you consider the graphics of the game, but also, I mean, like the handling, everything else that's going on with it. Maybe there's super advanced physics under the hood and that's using up a lot of processor, but you can't really see that in the current end result given how all over the place the content is. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's just not running fast enough. It doesn't really matter what the reasons are. It needs to run a lot faster. Sometimes you'll be driving along and the sound starts ripping apart as well, and you just have random stutters. It's really not acceptable, I'd say. And I'd really say the performance of this game and the nature of this game would place it more in a 0.6 alpha, pre-alpha version of the title, rather than it being a version 2.0. The type of technical issues this has is what you'd expect from a pre-release game, not a 2.0 patched release title that was sold for £70. Though now you could pick up for a lot cheaper, and I think people are having less problems on console, but you know, on PC it just should be a lot better. So the performance is still a massive problem. I'd also say when it comes to racing offline, if you're going to do the career mode, the AI, again, it's still just really lackluster to race against. Like, you can race against it. It is better than the AI in the original Assetto Corsa in many ways, but really just not interesting to race against. You really notice some specific behaviours. AI being really slow on corners, but then rocketing along straights and pulling away from you. You just don't end up with behaviour that seems like you're in an actual proper race a lot of the time. In comparison, I went side by side with this game and then Automobilista 2, and it was just a lot more fun driving the AI in Automobilista 2 by quite a long way. So, I mean, maybe the AI is better in this than it is in than it was in Gran Turismo before the Sophie AI stuff, but you know, it's just not. I don't think the single player really works properly, and it still just doesn't feel particularly fleshed out. It's like, I like the general idea of the single player, you know, gaining credits to enter races and having the pressure and not being able to fail. I think that's great general design approach, a roguelike or roguelite type single player. I think that's a great idea, but I just don't think it really comes together. Again, this really still feels like a 0.6, 0.7 pre-alpha of a game rather than a 2.0. it really, you can call a game release whatever number you want, you know, it's all made up at the end of the day, but a 2.0 would suggest a game that's finished and polished plus more, not a game that still doesn't feel like a release title. Now, I also need to point out, whilst being a negative Nancy, that in the multiplayer, the netcode, I think, actually might not be too terrible netcode. Like, you can have car contacts without super crazy stuff happening all the time. But unfortunately, you do end up with a lot of really laggy cars. You do have some cars warping, starting and stopping. It might be more just the players' connections, and with this being cross-play, you've got some people maybe on really dodgy Wi-Fi connections on their Xbox whilst they're on a yacht going across the channel. I don't know. But you've got some really janky multiplayer stuff going on, which is quite reminiscent in some ways to some of the weird netcode stuff you see in the Gran Turismo titles, but really quite out of place if you're used to playing your Le Mans Ultimate or your Race Room, which, not that those have perfect netcode, but the end result driving and the way the cars move and everything that happens in those games just is a lot more convincing than, on average, than when you play this online and there's quite a lot of cars doing a bit of warpy weirdness. So I don't know if that's a netcode or if that's just the nature of the game and the type of players on it and maybe how the servers are hosted in this, but that's a thing worth considering. Again, on console, people don't have much choice, but on PC, you have these really established titles now, and we're much used to a higher bar on PC, and so this sort of thing really stands out as being quite poor in Project Motor Racing. So, all in all, 2.0, a really good update, and probably a much more significant update for people that are playing on console than it is for people on PC. You can have fun playing this, doing online races. It is improving, but it does feel like it has a pretty sizable way to go. If this is 2.0, I think we're probably going to have to wait till 4.0 or 5.0 before you've really got what you would consider to be the £70 release title that meets about 15% of Ian Bell's hype tweets. Performance, graphics, consistency, AI, single player structure, all these things really need a lot of work. But hopefully they do keep working on it. It's better for everyone if they do. And I personally do really like to see more cross-platform racing simulators because I think they are important to the growth of sim racing, and also just having more players online and more people to race against. Gives you more competition, that gives you better racing, that gives you more entertainment. But there you go, guys. That is our rundown of the update. A true game changer. Let us know what you think in the comments. But until the next one, happy tea drinking, take care, and goodbye.